All right, so the next step is to kind of look at the different types of prompts that are available on the test. I shouldn't say available, that are required on the test, and kind of walk through how I would go about developing a thesis statement, okay? So the first one is question 2, and in class we'll refer to this as our synthesis prompt. So as I said in the past video, this is the one where it is a persuasive writing, and it's asking you to kind of survey the provided research and sources, but ultimately to develop your own opinion. So let's kind of look at the prompt so we know what to expect when we see one of these, and then we'll talk about how you develop that thesis statement. So the first part up here is just kind of the basics, like how much time you're supposed to use and things like that. Right here, this 40 minutes I think is a little misleading because you also have 15 minutes of reading time for sources, and that can be used too. So it's more like you have 55 minutes for this one, kind of depending how you spread it out. But let's go ahead and read through the prompt. Many recent college graduates have faced record levels of unemployment. This situation has led people to question what they value about higher education. Some high school students and their parents are wondering if college is worth the cost. Others, however, believe that a college education prepares students for more than just a job or career. So before I move on, I'm just going to underline what this one is about, which is a college education worth the cost? And they've kind of just given us some context on the issue and what the basic arguments are. So this is kind of the first part of a synthesis prompt, is it's going to provide that context or background on whatever the issue is. In this case, if college is worth the money. Now let's move on. Carefully read the following 6 sources, including the introductory information for each source. Then synthesize information from at least 3 of the sources and incorporate it into a coherent, well-developed essay that evaluates whether college is worth the cost. This right here is our task statement. So the second part or second piece of a synthesis prompt is what your task is. So for us, we need to evaluate whether college is worth its cost. So regardless of what the sources say, I'm supposed to tell you what I think in regards to whether college is worth the cost or not. Other things to note in this section is this right here. We need to pull from at least 3 of the sources. So that means of these 6, it looks like down here, 3 are required. Okay, next paragraph. Your argument should be the focus of your essay. Use the sources to develop your argument and explain the reasoning for it. Avoid merely summarizing the sources. Indicate clearly which sources you are drawing from, whether through direct quotation, paraphrase, or summary. You may cite the sources as source A, source B, etc., or use the descriptions in parentheses. So the last part is kind of like the expectations. What do they need from you? So that includes that your argument should be the focus of the essay. It's very easy with synthesis to get wrapped up in what the sources are saying, but primarily and most important is what you think. Then you can use the sources to develop your argument and explain the reasoning for it. And then it wants you to cite them like this or like this. So 3 required sources, and they all need to be cited. And that's super important because as your readers score these ones, they do a quick check to see what sources are used and to make sure you have those 3. So before I even look into what these 6 sources have to offer, because it's saying that my argument needs to be the central, I'm going to start with my argument. And my argument is that college is worth the money. As someone who went to college and as someone who values education, I think a college education is worth it. You might feel differently, and that's the point of the persuasive writing, okay? So in this case, my thesis can be quite simple. College simply is worth the cost. It's essentially my one single statement that answers the question that is provided up here in the task. Other ways that I could approach this thesis, I could look at the multiple perspectives and say, well, some people say this, college is still worth the cost. Now that is still fine. I am acknowledging what the opposition might say, but I'm still coming back to this fundamental thesis statement. Now, as I kind of break down my line of reasoning, remember we talked about how we can break it into claims. This is where that acronym for PEEPS might come in handy. Because I think the most obvious way to think about this one is the economical argument. So, talk about the money. Is the cost really that high? Things like that will hopefully be provided in the sources. In my argument, I would say that it is worth the cost up front. And then I could talk about things like student loans. I could talk about programs and grants and scholarships. There's lots of different ways that I could approach that economically. Another way I could approach it, again referring to my PEEPS acronym from the other video, is I could talk about it psychologically. Now, this could go both positive and negative. For example, I could talk about the stress that is inflicted with student loans, but I can also talk about the sense of fulfillment that someone gets from a college education. I could talk about how college prepares them for different life skills and life situations, and those would be more of a psychological argument, okay? So that's just kind of how I can start my thinking with those two, and those are kind of the pieces of my line of reasoning. But ultimately, as I go through the sources, I can kind of refine those and adapt those. But the big takeaway here is that I have this. It's a very simple response to the question that they provide, and I'm giving my answer to whether or not college is worth the cost. And this sentence needs to then be in my introduction, usually at the end, but it doesn't have to be there. Just to quickly review before we move on to the next one. In the notes video for thesis development, we talked about how a thesis needs to be defensible. This is an example of a defensible thesis because someone could disagree with me, and in that situation, they would argue that it isn't worth the cost. So that would make this an example of that defensible thesis that we're trying to get to.